recording this, which I think it's now doing. And I will share my slides. And if somebody could just give me a quick heads up or thumbs up or say they can see my slides, then I can start moving on.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
And so as I said, if you get any questions after this, you can email me. I'm trying to find where the chat function's gone because I've got hyperlinks to put into the chat. So bear with me to get that sorted because I've now lost chat. Well, that's not going to work. Okay, I will try and figure that out and give you the hyperlinks at some point. They should all be on the open site as well. Well, if you need anything, you can email me, ian.mclellan@uws.ac.uk, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. So today we are going to, I know it's kind of waste management, but I want to lead in from the land contamination point of view, because if you're working on site, you may have to bring some soil in, you may have to transport some material offsite. So I'm looking at it, we're going to talk about the land contamination aspects, then we'll move into waste management. And then unfortunately for you, I'm going to give you some homework to do. It's one page, it's one A4 page, 3 paragraphs, that's it. Have you all been given your case study? Excellent. So
yeah.
As we go through this today, I want you to think about your case study and think about everything that's going on there and what waste could potentially be made on that site and what waste could arise on that site. And it's not just going to be as obvious as there might be waste soil or there might be pallets. It's all the things that go on in your site. Porta cabins for the canteens, porta cabins for the offices. What's inside an office? There's paper, there's batteries and a remote control. There's lots of little things that you might not think about as you go through. So just as we're going to do this, just start thinking about what might crop up on your case study. Now, my PhD was on the effects of humans on soils. And then my job is jobs over the years to take him into land contamination. So that's why we're talking about this first, because it does all relate together. And there's 2 definitions, and I'm going to either talk about contaminated land or land contamination. When I'm talking about contaminated land, there is a specific definition within the Environmental Protection Act. Now, that act covers the whole of the UK. Okay, we'll look at it in a bit more detail later on, but the act is for the whole of the UK. And the definition is there, so I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but the bottom line there, SPOSH, you're looking at significant possibility of significant harm. It's a great acronym, SPOSH, just rolls off the tongue. Significant possibility of significant harm. And that's either to, so there's lots of receptors, but it could be, and we'll look at the receptors, but it's any substance in, on, or under the land that's affecting receptors or is affecting the water environment. Okay. The other definition that we're looking at is land contamination, and that is just land where there's contamination present, but it may not be significant. Okay, so the difference between the two, and a site that's got contamination and that land contamination is the significance of it. So SPOSH, significant possibility of significant harm. So when I'm talking about contaminated land, that's what I'm talking about. And if I'm just talking about land contamination, that's the phrases. So just keep that in mind, that there is a legal definition of contaminated land under Part 2A of the Environmental Protection Act. And some of you may have already heard of Part 2A. If you talk to any contaminated land officer, they'll just talk about Part 2A, and it's because of this act. As I said, it applies across the whole of the UK, but there are different policies and guidance for each of the devolved administrations apart from Northern Ireland, and we'll look at that when we get there. Brownfield land, derelict land. So this is land that's previously been used. It may be lying vacant at the moment. It may be able to be brought up into beneficial use just now once it has been remediated. And then you've got greenfield sites, and that's sites that have never been developed. So it's entirely possible that there will be contamination present on the brownfield sites and on the derelict sites because of whatever use, industrial use, commercial use that happened there. There is also the potential for contamination to be present on greenfield sites. So that could be agricultural lands that a farmer sold for a wind farm development or for a housing development. In years gone by, pesticides, herbicides, wood preservatives, everything you might find on a farm would contain metals and persistent organic pollutants. Now, these are compounds that can be in the soil for many years to come, even after they've not been used for a while. So even though you are working on what could be pristine sites or thought to be pristine sites that is just agricultural land, there could be contamination present there. And most government policy, certainly up in Scotland, and I'm pretty sure down in England, although you need to check that, the policy is to bring the brownfield and regenerate areas back into use for sustainable economic growth, rather than building on greenfield sites, which I'm pretty sure is the same across the whole of the UK. Within the EPA, the Part 2, there are 3 definitions as well. So you've got your source, which is your pollutant, which is causing harm to the water environment or to the receptor. You've got the receptors, and it's quite a broad definition. Now, a receptor is a living organism, a group of living organisms, an ecological system, or a piece of property. Okay. And the water environment. So a living organism, it can be a human being, it could be the pet dog, it could be badgers. Ecological system, we've got I think we had an ecological clerk of work in here, didn't we? That was, who was that? Emma, you're the ecological clerk of work. So you'll be able, yeah. I know all the ecology that goes on there. So if you've got the pollutant, and if you've got any of those receptors, and you've got the pathway, and that could be any means of how the pollutant gets to the receptor. And if that is a significant linkage, then that is the Part 2A. That's the contaminated land I'm talking about. So there could be many different so let's just take me as a receptor and a benzene drum lying under the ground. I've got a couple of kids. The kids are playing in the garden. I've got a pet dog. The dog likes to bury things in the garden. There's I grow vegetables. I eat the vegetables. Already, that one source, and me as a receptor, gets many different things. So I could inhale the fumes from the benzene. So there's one pathway. If the benzene has leaked and got near where I'm growing my vegetables, and I eat the vegetable that's got benzene in it, that's ingestion. So that's a possible pathway. The kids are playing in the garden. Children don't like to wash their hands as often as they should do, so they've got muddy hands, skin absorption, and ingestion. So one source, perhaps one receptor, but multiple different pathways. And it's thinking about all of that, and then trying to determine the significance of those linkages that you can then work out whether your land is contaminated land or just suffers from contamination. And you need all 3 of these. And I'm sure you might be familiar with the term of a conceptual site model, but it's how these linkages get to each other. And if you draw, I mean, I've seen ones that are quite arty. I've seen ones that I've drawn that are just basically stick people and stick dogs. But as long as you're showing the pathway between your source and your receptors, then you're fine. So what causes contamination? Pretty much everything humans do and work on will cause some form of contamination. You can get direct, so point source pollution, so a diesel or petrol drum leaking at a garage forecourt, or you can have more diffuse pollution or indirect contamination appearing. So agricultural works, nitrates, for example, fertilizers. But you may have to work on some of these sites in your course. I mean, somebody said they worked in HS2. I'm pretty sure not only does that cross over greenfield sites, it's probably going to go through, especially in London and Birmingham, it's going to go through industrial areas where there's been lots of different activities going on there. So you will, across the course of your career, work in sites that is quite varied. You can get naturally occurring gases, so radon, particularly if there's granites. You will get naturally elevated concentrations. So jumping back down to Cornwall there's high levels of tin in the soil because there used to be tin mining down there. So there's naturally elevated levels down there. And if you look at various other countries in the world, there are naturally elevated concentrations of some metals. And that's fine because that's the natural one. The problem occurs if you have concentrations above the naturally occurring levels. So we talk about potentially toxic elements that were used to be known as heavy metals. But if you actually look at a periodic table and you're a chemist, then these metals are relatively light in comparison to some of the actual metals. So tend not to use heavy metals, go with the term potentially toxic elements. We need elements for natural well-being. So we need macronutrients, we need micronutrients. But if we take in anything above that, then they're toxic to us, hence toxic elements. And if you get a group, so these arsenic, cadmium, copper, chromium, mercury, lead, and zinc, if you see them elevated, then you begin to think contamination. And if you do some statistics in some soils and you get to see some of these grouped together, because there's been plenty of studies show that, then it tends to be contamination as well. And how these act and behave in the soil is a whole different lecture on that. But if you've got acidic conditions, the metals are more mobile, so they'll flow through the soil column quickly. Then they could get into the aquifers and water environment quicker than more natural pH soils. And yes, they've been used in agriculture. They've been used in the wood industry. Various different sectors there, pigments, paints, and waste disposal as well. So that's the inorganic. Then you've got the organic, so hydrocarbons, the BTEX there, the benzene, toluene, ethyl benzene, and xylene. You've got DNAPO and LNAPO. I won't put you on the spot if you know those acronyms. So NAPO, that stands for non-aqueous phase liquid. The D being dense, the L being light. So dense will sink through the water column. The L will float on top of the water column. So if you've got an aquifer and you're putting down a borehole to look at potential water contamination, if you've got an LNAPO and your borehole goes straight through that, you're not going to pick it up. And you're also potentially moving contamination down further into the aquifer, which is a problem. Or conversely, if you've got a DNAPO and your borehole only goes halfway through the aquifer, then you're going to not sample the DNAPO. So you need to know a little bit about what pollutants are present. So working with experts, chemists that know that stuff to figure out where perhaps a borehole should go will help you. Then you've got POPs, persistent organic pollutants. They're persistent, so that a long half-life. They're organics, so these are some of the compounds here, and yeah, they're very bioaccumulative in the environment, and they do go for long-range transport as well. Now, some are banned under the Stockholm Protocol, hyperlink there. There is also a candidate list, I think that's the correct term, of ones that could become banned, so check that out. So there's lots of organics out there that could potentially cause problems. We do have problems, or you can detect radionuclides. So that 137 and that 19 to 226 is the isotope number. for the elements, so 137 cesium, 90 strontium, and 226 radon. They'll be present in the soil. And they've come from various nuclear accidents, Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, Windscale, which is now Sellafield. They came from luminescence, and there was a case in Scotland that luminescence was a problem at a place called Dalgety Bay. So if those folk from the East Coast may have heard of Dalgety Bay, that was potentially a problem for Part 2A contaminated land. And you've got the two nuclear testing, but you've also got the 2 nuclear bombs that were dropped during the Second World War. Get pathogens. There's a nice bacteria from my PhD, and they could be present. And then, yeah, we're creating new things all the time. So there could be new things coming out there that we initially thought were quite inert, didn't do much, but in actual fact, there is a problem. Like chlorofluorocarbons from the 1960s, 70s, when they were first developed, they were chemically inert. As soon as they go up into the stratosphere, they break down, a chlorine atom flies off and destroys the ozone layer. So you're always on the lookout for new emerging pollutants. Any questions in that before I go any further? Because I've kind of went through that quite quick. Joseph.
Hi, since you asked, yeah, I was wondering, because I'm not too clued up on the old chemistry of land contamination. And I was just wondering if you have some kind of accessible source that could help go into it a little bit more, so I could, because that was interesting, but it was all new to me. So
let me look. There'll be a couple of kind of online textbook type things that, or older editions of textbooks that I could try and find for you. I've got a list in my bookcase next to me, but I'll see if there's kind of older versions online for you to look at. Any other questions? No. So that was that was the definitions and the causes of. Now we want to start looking at what happens. So you've got this vacant land site, you've got this derelict land site that's sitting there, damaged, there's contamination there. So how do you bring it back into beneficial use? Now, it could go through the planning system and the planning authority, but they need to be aware of any potential contamination on that site. And the whole aim of that, if you're doing it through that system, is to make sure that it doesn't become contaminated land as Part 2A, because then there's a whole lot of liability that will go on to your project that wasn't there in the first place. So think about human health, think about the wider environment, so water contamination, and what could potentially go wrong when you're developing a site. So what does suitable for use mean? Well, it's ensuring that land is suitable for its current use by identifying and removing any risk that's there to the human health and environment. It's ensuring that land is suitable for any future use. And then so future use might depend on what's going to go there. Is it a commercial zone? Is it an industrial zone? Or is it housing development? And you've got to assess the potential risks for contamination based on the planning permission that's given, and remediating the land before new use commences. And it's limiting the requirements of any remediation going on to just addressing the unacceptable risks. Okay, so that's a kind of cost benefit analysis thing going on there to work out what you have to do to make the land suitable for the future use. And I'm not going into remediation. There's a whole lot of different remediation techniques that can happen. One of the ones that was commonly used is called dig and dump. The contaminated land is taken from a site and then just dumped into a landfill. Dig and dump, it's excavation, but dig and dump, and that will weave through some of the things that we're looking at later on. So within the suitable for use framework, you've got to think that if you're on a large industrial site, if your project is on, or the project that you're doing is on a large industrial site, there could have been many different activities going on that site. So if you think about working and you're cutting through what used to be a factory that produces dyes and paints, so you'll have the production area. There could be contamination associated with that. There'll be a canteen, likely not to have contamination. There'll be office, there'll probably not any contamination there. There'll be a generator room, there'll be a boiler, potentially contamination there. There'll be a car park. So when you're thinking about that, and you're working on a large site, there are going to be different areas within that site that may have contamination or are likely to have contamination, and ones that are likely not to have contamination. You've got to think about that as you go through that. And not the important thing here is not all of that's going to be documented. You shouldn't create new pollutant linkages, and that goes with your demolition activities or bringing material on site. Convincing the planning authority that you have broken those contamination risks and that you've cleared it up and that the site is suitable for use and that you have done what you said you were going to do with the planning applications or conditioned requirements as part of your consent to build. Now, all of this is in this document here, and that was one of the things I was going to put into the chat. So when we go for a break, what I'll do is if I can get into the chat when I stop sharing, I will put all these hyperlinks in for you. So this is land contamination development for contaminated land regulators in Scotland. However, some of the key principles in there would also work throughout the rest of the UK. If you keep in mind that the legislation where you work in Cornwall, in Chester, will be different to some of the policies that we do up here. So that's available for you to look at. I was in the writing panel for that with about 7 other contaminated land officers from the whole of Scotland. And then this here, we no longer have a Department of Environment, but when it existed, they produced these industry profiles. I think there's 40-ish of them. And this one here, for instance, would tell you all the activities that would happen on a railway land. So a depot, sidings, and the associated contamination likely to be found with each of those activities. Now, although there's not a Department of Environment, an organisation called Clerk have downloaded these and have uploaded them to their own website. And again, I'll give you the link to them as well. They're great for identifying what contamination might be present when you're working on a site. But again, they'll apply for the whole of the UK. This one is a Scottish document, but can help your thinking as you go through. So that was planning consents and planning conditions and bringing up suitable for use. This is the legislation. So this is part 2A. SPOSH, I've covered this. And that is ensuring that appropriate remediation happens. So a local authority is required to go out and find contamination or to look for contaminated land in their area. It's the exact same with local authorities. In air pollution, they're required to go out and monitor air pollution to determine if there's air pollution, and the same with noise. So under the part 2A of this, they're required to go out and find contaminated land. Now, if it is determined as contaminated land as part 2A, so that's significant possibility of significant harm, then the house, the property, the area, the site will go on a contaminated land register. The regulator, which in Scotland is, which across the UK is the local authority. So in Scotland, we've got 32 local authorities, so they would be the main regulator. They're responsible for finding out who's going to pay for the cleanup. If there were explosives manufactured at a site, or if the contamination is affecting the drinking water, or if there are IPC plants on that site, then it's the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, SEPA, or the Environment Agency that then are the responsible organisations in Scotland and in England. So site's been declared Part 2A, they've then got to find out who pays for this. Now, this is why when you're working on a site, you do not want to create a pollutant linkage by bringing contaminated material onto your site or by digging through contamination and creating pollutant linkages. Because if you create a pollutant linkage, if you create this Part 2A site, then you caused that pollution. Therefore, you are the appropriate person. You're the Class A person. So then it would be you that would have to pay for that. Now, you may not have caused the original contamination, but if you're creating the source pathway receptor and it's a significant linkage, you're the responsible person. Okay, so you would pay for it, or your project would pay for it. Now, if they people can't be found, then it falls onto the landowner. So the owner occupier of that land. Again, and there's been a case in Scotland, in fact, there was 2 cases in Scotland, that there was a print work that closed down at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Houses were built in the 1970s. And then in 2012 to 2014, the local authority found significant levels of arsenic and lead and zinc. And should have declared it Part 2A. That would have meant every single household paying between £11,000 and £33,000 each, even though they didn't cause the contamination. But they're the Class B people. They then get a remediation notice delivered, and then you're required to remediate the ground. Again, during the remediation process, you cannot create new pollutant linkages. Sites can be declared Part 2A for radionuclides. At the moment, that's not happened in Scotland, and I don't think it's happened in England, but I need to check that one. There is separate guidance available to that up here. In England and Wales, there's a completely different statutory guidance that we'll look at. The Scottish guidance was updated in 2006. The English and Welsh were updated in 2012. Our guidance up here is a couple of 100 pages long. The English and Welsh is only 70 pages long, so much more streamlined. And again, I can give you the links to these. There is no Part 2A in Northern Ireland, but if you are working in Northern Ireland, make sure you follow whatever regulations are set in place for you. There's a big difference between England and Wales and Scotland. In England and Wales, in this 10 years ago, they came up with category screening levels. Now, there are 4 category screening levels. Number 1, it's definitely not contaminated. Number 4, it is definitely contaminated. Number 2 is, we don't think it's contaminated, but it might be. And number 3 is, we think it's contaminated, but it might not be. Okay, so that's a 4. So if you're looking at contaminated land, or if you're looking at the guidance and they talk about category 4 screening levels, then that's the value that it would be definitely contaminated. Now, we don't have that up here in Scotland, but we do use, there's a model the UK government have produced called CLEAR. It's the Contaminated Land Exposure Assessment Tool model. They talk about the category 4 screening level. And that's what they use to develop that model. So if you're working up in Scotland, it's not there, but you might see reference to it in any of the documents that you're working your way through. But those 4 categories are live and working down in England and Wales. So keep remembering that Scotland is we're all devolved administrations, and we do have different legislation, we do have different policies. Okay. And you have to work to the country's legislations that you're working in. So whilst I'm just doing this just now here, remember that you as the competent person on site, you as the trained decal or ecological clerk of work need to know what legislation you're working your way through. Particularly, also the project managers, etc., would need to know what they're doing. European Liability Directive, that's in Scotland. There'll be an equivalence down in England. The polluter pays principle. So if your site creates pollution, you're paying for the cleanup. Now, it's not retrospective, so it's not to any pollution before 2009, but it's looking at significant damage to land, water, or biodiversity. Now, if you're putting a wind farm up in a peat bog, there's going to be water trickling about. That's just the very nature of a peat bog. There'll be species up there, there'll be ecosystems, there'll be biodiversity up there. So you have to be careful that you're not causing significant damage, okay, with the site work that's going on. Up here, and I don't think there's an English or Welsh equivalent, we have the Regulatory Reform Scotland Act. So this amends Part 2A. So remember I told you that when a site is declared Part 2A, it's got to go onto a contaminated land register. Now, if that was somebody's individual house, that's then going, and it appears in this register, that's going to cause somebody's house price to fall. It's going to cause the neighbouring houses to plummet as well. So to save that blight happening, there was a decision made that once a site and once the regulator has been is convinced and has been shown that a site has been remediated, then it comes off the contaminated land register and goes onto a non-contamination. It goes onto a non-contaminated register. Okay. I don't think that exists down in England and Wales. So once it's on that register, it stays regardless of it being cleaned up. But you might want to check that. Likewise, SEPA can take off a special site from that register. And this act here also introduces the environmental harm offence. So it's harm to humans or the living organisms, the quality of air, water and land, interference or impairment of ecosystems, impairment or interference with legitimate uses of the environment, damage to properties or offence to the senses of human beings. So it is an environmental harm to act to harm the environment, permit someone to harm the environment, fail to act to stop someone harming the environment, or permit another person not to act. So there's 4 ways you can do it: act, permit to act, not to act, or let somebody else not to act. Okay, so they're quite wide definitions there. Again, if you're working on a site and you cause this environmental harm, then that's a problem. It would come back to your project that you're working on. So £40,000 fine, 12 months in the jail, or both. Okay. So just quickly on remediation, who pays for it? Well, it can be voluntarily through the planning system. So the consent could be given to a housing developer to build the houses on this land, providing you clean the land up. There you go. The developer will clean it up. For Part 2A, it's the person that caused it, or it's the person that occupies the site, which is unfair. You look at a cost-benefit analysis and you decide which one's better. Now, there are different ways you can do it. You can clean the soil. You can put chemicals down to stabilize and solidify the pollution from moving through the water column. You can do chemistry, you can do oxidation of chemicals, or so oxidation is loss, so reduction is gain. So adding and oxidizing and reducing the chemicals. So chromium, the 2 different versions, species of chromium, chromium-3 and chromium-6. One's harmful, one's not harmful. Arsenic, there's 2 species of that. One's harmful, one's not. That's the way of looking at it. You can thermally treat your soil, so you can basically burn it, you can incinerate it, or you can just basically turn the soil into glass. You nuke it. Now, these are not sustainable, but it's ways of making sure that you're driving off organic pollutants or immobilizing inorganic pollutants. And it just depends where you're working on. If you've got different contamination on different parts of the site, then you're going to use different techniques. For the water environment, you can use permeable reactive barriers. So that's a barrier that goes down into the aquifer and the water passes through it. And as it passes through the barrier, chemical reactions on the barrier will reduce the toxicity of what's going out the other end, or they'll absorb onto that. So it's dirty water in, clean water out the other side. You can put a cap down. So you can have your contaminated land and you can put down some bright plastic, a cap, and then some import soil on top of that. But again, that's breaking the barrier. So the contaminated soil can't get through, the contamination can't get through the barrier. So you've broken that linkage. Or you dig and dump. Again, depending on your site, depending on what contamination is there, you can use different techniques. So let's move on. You will have the link for this, and this is how materials management. So this is us beginning to move away from the contaminated land and the land contamination aspects onto the waste management aspects of what happens on a site. And this is here, and this is a CEPA's version. There is an English and Welsh equivalent that you can find. It talks about how CEPA will enforce and regulate contamination or bringing material onto site, the licenses that you can be granted, and what you're allowed to do. So up here, you're only allowed to bring in if the use is necessarily part of the planned works, that it's suitable for that use, that the material doesn't require any processing. You don't bring on more than you need to bring on, that its use is a possibility, but not a certainty. Sorry, it's a certainty and not a mere possibility. Sorry, you've got to be sure that you're going to use it and not just perhaps use it. And then the stuff that you're bringing in to your site, which is entirely possible if you've got an embankment and you've got fill to bring in to make an embankment, you're bringing soil on, then you've got to ensure that that isn't going to result in pollution or to harm human health. Okay, so I'll go through that again. The use is necessary, that it's a certainty and not just a possibility. It's suitable for the use that you're bringing it on, and it's not going to harm the environment or human health. Therefore, it doesn't need any other treatment before it's put on, and you're only bringing on the amounts that you need. Okay. So that leads on to your duty of care under waste management. So every organisation that produces waste has a duty of care to see that waste is passed to somebody who is authorised to accept that waste. And if you or your project haven't done those checks, and then that waste was illegally disposed of, like fly tipping or put into an unauthorised landfill site, then you're responsible for that. Your project would be liable for that. So you are the person, your project are the responsible people for checking that who's taking your waste is licensed to carry that waste, and that the landfill that you're sending it to, the treatment facility or the landfill that you're sending it to, is authorised to accept that type of waste. And that goes with soil, because there's a strict definition of what waste is that we'll get to after the break. We will look at the waste classification, but you must classify waste before it's moved, disposed of, or recovered. And there is guidance, and we're going to look at that. And that needs to be, and that is available to anybody who is producing this waste. It's come back to your duty of care. You need to be able to, you need to correctly classify this waste so that you know what type of landfill it's going to and what type of license that you need to apply for. So the person needs to be competent in assessing waste, hazardous waste. So think somebody that's good at chemistry. So you need to look at consultancies that would be able to classify and identify the waste or the contamination within a waste. So landfill waste acceptance criteria. These are only applicable for landfill acceptance and doesn't state whether the waste is hazardous or non-hazardous. And then there may be additional review from the local authority or the regulator if there's controlled activities regs, some of the waste regulations, and mobile plant licensing. So that's for you. So any waste that you generate on your site, so if we're looking at, again, a wind farm, any waste that you generate on there, you have that duty of care to know where it's going and who's taking that waste. And you're responsible for classifying it before it leaves your site. So yep, there's some different remediation of options there. In situ, so do it where it is. Ex situ, dig it up. This is the one we're going to look at, perhaps that a lot of organizations do, although it's not very good for the environment. It's called dig and dump. Sorry, there's a picture of the capping that I told about. See that bright yellow color, that bright orange color, and this is down when the Olympic Games were getting built. So there's the cap. So anything underneath that is clearly contaminated. They're putting this cap down so that the pollution can't migrate up the barrier. They're putting in some fill here before putting whatever they're building on top of it. It's brightly coloured so that if anybody's operating a JCB and they dig through it, they immediately know that they've done something wrong and that there's something underneath there that needs exploring because you shouldn't get soil that colour. There will be, when you're looking at remediation, you need to record batch numbers, the lifespan of this, how the seals were joined up, because that's part and parcel of the liability. If you sell the site to somebody else, the person who's buying it needs to know of what's down there so that they're fully aware of what's going on. So you need to record like batch number, any problems, if there was a rip, how the rip was fixed, that all gets recorded somewhere. And this is dig and dump. I'll give you an interesting story about this. This is about 5 miles from the university. One person wanted to build an extension out her back door. They get builders in, the builders went down, and within 2 or 3 shovelfuls of dirt, black ooze and tar started coming out her soil. It was later discovered that the houses were built on top of an old gasometer. The houses had to be demolished. All the back gardens of this house had to be dug down to a depth of 4 meters, and then their new soil put on top of it. If this site was declared Part 2A, it would have cost £4 million for those householders to do up, but the Scottish Government paid for that. But that was done through dig and dump because there was no other way of cleaning this stuff up than just digging it and taking it to the landfill site. Now, we have the Scottish landfill tax. There is an English equivalent. And most you've got, when you send things to landfill, you pay about £100 per tonne to send something to landfill. And that's before gate fees get added onto it as well. So it's an expensive business sending something to landfill. And there are bans on things going to landfill. So this is the landfill directive. Remember, any EU law that was transposed into British law, Scots law, stands, even though we're outside the EU. But so the landfill directive banned from landfill liquids, corrosives, explosives, oxidizers, infectious hospital wastes, and tires, and some biodegradable waste as well. So biodegradable waste up here is banned from the 1st of January 2025. So biodegradable stuff like food waste from businesses needs to be kept and treated with themselves. The UK had different types of targets to set. We have different types of waste, municipal and biodegradable, and we've got different landfill, hazardous, non-hazardous, and inert, and we'll look at what these are soon. What's not covered is where waste is unloaded for preparation for recovery and treatment, or storage of waste prior to treatment for less than 3 years. So we'll look at this after the break. If we look at Scotland, a ban on the use of macerators, recycling's got to happen. This has got to happen, as said, by 2025. Now let's look at landfill tax. The equivalent happens down south, because it was a UK Parliament Act before it came up here in 2015. We're now about, in fact, we are almost £100 per tonne. I expect at the 1st of April next year for it to go above £100. So for every tonne of something your local authority sends to landfill or your project sends to landfill is going to cost you a minimum of £100, because then you get gate fees on top of that. If you're sending inert materials, so that's non-contaminated rocks and soils, so calcium sulfates, calcium hydroxides, then it's only £3.15, so it's much cheaper. But if you're on a site that's contaminated, then it's going to be expensive for you. Does it work? Who knows? This is from the SEPA website. You can look, there'll be something else. This is the amount of waste going to landfill. This is the amount of landfill tax. Remember, causation and correlation don't always exist together. So you can see that it's beginning to level out here. So have we reached peak recycling here in Scotland? Because it's beginning to level out regardless of how much landfill tax goes up. You can see that waste is beginning to level out. So why is disposal to landfill bad? Well, this is a site near the university. Up here, just off screen, would be a landfill site. It's an old landfill site, because on top of that now are tennis courts and a couple of football pitches, like 5-a-side football pitches. But this burn flows underneath it, and you can see that, well, no water should be that color. So there's clear staining going on. So something's oxidizing the iron to rust. It's quite a murky looking water, so there's some turbidity going on there as well. So something is going on here. You can also see little cans poking out there. So you get leachate. You can get landfill gas. So here is, I don't know if anybody's heard of this. This is Glasgow in Derbyshire. There was a landfill site near this house, and it migrated through the rocks. So high pressure will keep the gas in the ground. Low atmospheric pressure, the gas will just migrate up. And it migrated into the basement of this house, and it was flowing at quite a big rate. So it flowed into the bottom of this house. It eventually found its way, just through various natural processes, into the boiler system. When the boiler clicked on in the morning, the house exploded. Now, there were no fatalities there, but you can see what the house used to look like and look at what it's like now. So that's why we tend not to send things to landfill. Pollutants and landfill gas and leachate. Now, I'm going to propose that we take a tea break, and I'm going to stop sharing just now, and I'll take any questions. It's almost bang on 11 o'clock, so I'm going to happily take any questions from you. I will pause the recording just now when we go for a tea break and you ask questions. So I'm going to pause it now. Except we're not, because I've not shared the screen yet, have I? No. And if somebody can tell me you can see my slides, I'll just start moving on.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks.
With Teams, you get to see the nice red border around about it, but I don't ever get to see that in Zoom. Anyhow, so let's start moving on to the waste management aspects of this. I think we should be done for about 10 past 12, quarter past 12, so you get a little bit of time back in your day. The EU, these statistics are before COVID. COVID was its whole little aberration that's affected all statistics. So these are before COVID. 2.6 billion tonnes of waste was generated within the European Union before COVID, and most of it from the construction and mining sector. Compared to the UK, 2.6 million tonnes, again, mainly construction and mining. How do we dispose of it? Well, the EU, straight to landfill, 43%, recycling, 39%. The UK, we're better on recycling, but pretty similar on sending stuff to landfills. So this data came from the Eurostat data website that you can get yourself if you want to do it. I just converted this. So this center line is the European average of 39%. Everything above it means they're doing better on recycling. Everything below it is they're doing worse than the European average on recycling. So you can see the UK is in the positive side of it, with Italy up here doing quite well and Bulgaria down here doing less well. But so that's fine. We're recycling in the UK. Disposal, so this is the European average of 43%. Everything up here means more disposal, so that's bad. Everything down here means less disposal, which is good. You can see the UK is just pretty much about the EU average, so we could do things better than sending things to landfill. Yeah. So that's some statistics. On top of these statistics, you've got the human side of waste, which I don't cover in this, but if anybody wants to look at the Basel Action Network video, if I can find the chat, I could maybe bring the chat up. No, I've lost the chat. The Basel Action Network, looking at waste, and this is waste that was shipped off to China. Now, China have closed their doors to foreign imports, but there are other countries in the world that accept waste, particularly waste electrical equipment, and you will see the human scale and devastation that this also causes, as well as the environmental impact of it. Okay, so there's a lot of problems with waste and shipping it elsewhere. So let's look at the Waste Framework Directive. But before I do there, now I clicked on this hyperlink at break to give you the link. This link is broken. So I need to get you this, this hyperlink sorted, and I'll get that to you somehow, probably through the CPG department. But there are zero waste plans. Countries will have waste action plans and waste audits and action. So this is a Scottish one. So when you're looking at your project, you should also look at the principles behind this to come up with zero waste from your site. And in this one, 70% of recycling for all waste by 2025 and a maximum of 5% to landfill. So if you want to have a look, Zero Waste Scotland website, you get a lot of information there. And you can find, I will try and find this action plan for you again. It may be updated, but certainly the hyperlink that I've got here is broken today. So this is the Waste Framework Directive, and there is the waste hierarchy, and this is the waste hierarchy. The definition of waste within the directive is waste means any substance or object which the holder discards or intends or is required to discard. So if you dig up some soil and you're not going to use it again, so you're going to intend to get rid of it, that is a waste. And the waste hierarchy here is how we are supposed to treat. And you're supposed to, whenever you've got waste, you're supposed to follow this waste hierarchy to look at ways of minimizing the waste. So the first thing is prevention. Let's take a basic example. If you go into a supermarket and you pick up a turnip or and it's wrapped in plastic, there's no need for a turnip to be wrapped in plastic. You peel the outsides of it off anyway, so don't wrap it in plastics. That's prevention. So then we don't have to worry about it. There's lots of fancy shops out there that you can take in your own Tupperware dish and fill up your cereal with. Again, that's reducing plastic at that source, so it doesn't become a waste. Okay, so that, if you can keep that up there, then that's fine. Everything else is waste, including things you're sending to recycling. Remember, discard. So if you're discarding it, even though it's going to recycling, that is still a waste. And we've got different definitions. The last possible thing you should do is send it to landfill. You need to consider everything else. So on your site, in your project, you need to think about, what are you actually bringing onto the site? Does a pallet have to be wrapped in plastic for the things that's on there? Do we need as much on? Because if we're not going to use it, we need to discard it. So is that a waste? And you've got to look at all of this whilst not endangering human health and the environment with particular risk to water, air, soil, plants, and animals, without causing nuisance through noise or odors. Now in Scotland, noise nuisance and odor nuisance is a statutory nuisance, so would be dealt with by the local authority, and then without adversely affecting the places of special scientific interest or special interest. So that's just the principles that you've got to do it with. It does introduce the polluter pays principle. We've talked about that before, and the extended producer responsibility. There's lots of things out there on the internet about extended producer responsibility that you can go and look at. It brings in provisions in hazardous waste and waste oil, so other directives have been repealed, and it gives us 2 targets. So this was by 2020. Now, the way that a lot of environmental statistics works is it takes a number of years for the data to be collected and verified and ratified before it's published. So the 2020 target was 50% preparing for reuse and recycling of waste materials from households or origins similar to households. So that could be like a canteen producing waste or an office producing paper waste or something. That could be that. And then 70% prepare for reuse and recycling and other recovery of construction and demolition work, where most of you will be working on. So 50% for waste similar to households, 70% for constructions. Now, I have got the wrong value in here. I will get you the update value. I thought I'd updated this slide because there were statistics that came out not that long ago. So if you give me 2 seconds, I'm going to bring up another lecture that I gave because I've got the exact value in there. It was to this class. Was it this class? No. Nope, I just updated slides and I can't remember where I updated the slides. This one. So let me just bring up these values here. I said July 2021, but I am going to bring up the correct values that I've managed to find, the most up-to-date ones. Sorry, folks, I thought I had updated this. As it currently stands, the UK, so these were the statistics that came out in May 2022, not the July 2021 that you're seeing on this slide here. It was the UK 44.4% recycling rate in 2020, so that's down 1.6% from that. So we're now sitting at 2020 figure was 44.4%. We still don't have a value for 2020 for this this one yet, but certainly the UK recycling has decreased from 46.2% to 44.4%. And apologies for not updating that slide here. So you can see there's still a little bit to do, and we seem to be slightly worse than that. You've got bio waste. So here's a picture on some biological waste, so food waste, garden waste, kitchen waste. So if you're on a site and you've got a porta cabin in Scotland, waste, food waste more than 5 kilograms must be collected separately. It can't be put in. So if you produce more than 5 kilograms of food waste in Scotland, you need to deal with that separately. You can't just put it into the normal bin. You've got hazardous waste. Now in Scotland, we call it special waste. I think we're the only country in the world that calls it special waste. Everybody else calls it hazardous waste, but up here we call it special waste. Don't know. But this is anything that's irritant, harmful, toxic, carcinogenic, corrosive, infectious, mutagenic, and sensitizing. So a lot of things that you perhaps have got in your house, or in an office, or any site that you're going to work in. Now, asbestos, remember, for asbestos, you need your own specialist contractors to deal with that. But printer toner, batteries, solvents, pesticide, oils, ozone depleting substances, and hazardous waste containers. Now, if you've got a porta cabin that's used as a canteen, you're going to have a fridge. If there's a wee TV in there, you're going to have a battery for the remote control. You're going to produce food waste. If you've got generators on site, there's going to be oils produced, perhaps. So, see what I mean? It might just be in your head, you're thinking, well, it's a wind turbine site, there's going to be soil. When you start looking at the whole site operation, then you start bringing other things in as well. And remember, batteries need to be collected separately because they cannot go to landfill. Because as well as the chemicals in it, they're easily caught fire when they start to break down. And a fire in a landfill site is very difficult to put out. So let's start looking at some of the things that they talk about. So prevention, so that is measures which are taken before something becomes a waste. So look at reusing, looking at extending the lifespan of a product. Now, I know that nowadays, a lot of electrical equipment comes with built-in obsolescence. I mean, my mobile phone is only a year and a half, maybe 2 years old, and I'm charging it 2 or 3 times a day, which is ridiculous. But we get that built-in obsolescence. I had to just get a new fridge in the house, fridge freezer. The other one, because I kept the receipt, broke down almost 7 years to the day since we bought it. The receipt was like the 28th of August, and I had to get a new one at the beginning of August. Reuse is any way in which something can be used again for its original purpose. And then preparing it is making sure that it's clean and can be brought into beneficial use without further processing and without waste management controls. Remember, this is before it becomes a waste. This is when it becomes a waste. You all know about recycling. I won't ask if you all recycle correctly, because it can be difficult to recycle correctly. It can be difficult to know what types of plastic get recycled in your area. I've got an honours student who's looking at recycling in Scotland, and the number of different bins that each local authority has is unbelievable. The green bin, for instance, is used for different things in different local authorities. You would think it would just be the same bin, the same colour across the whole of the country, but it's not. So correctly recycling is difficult. And then recovery, that's ways in which you can bring things, so energy from waste, so anaerobic digestion, and you can have incineration, recycling organics, metals, acids and bases, oils, and then some land treatment things. So that's what recovery is. And then treatment is making sure that, so this is householders are excluded, but Article 15, this is what we're talking about. Member states have a duty to ensure that all waste producers or holders of waste carry out treatment according to the waste hierarchy: prevention, reuse, recycle, recover, dispose. So when your waste is produced in your site, waste is produced in your project, excuse me, you need to look at ways of reducing that. So the easiest thing to do is look at what is coming onto your site in the first place. Because if you can tell your supplier saying, well, that pallet or that delivery of pallets, that material does not have to be wrapped in all that shrink wrap, don't do it, then that's not your problem. That's not your waste. So you're automatically minimizing the amount of waste that you have to deal with. And then disposal, that's just chucking things into landfill. Remembering that you've got the landfill directive about what can go into landfill and the different types of landfill that are there to accept. So inert, hazardous, and non-hazardous. So this is coming down to the waste management plan that the projects that you're working on should have. The countries under the Waste Framework Directive are required to produce their own waste management plans. And again, if you look at the Net Regs website, just Google waste management plan, you get lots of different ones pop up for you. It's only for England, sorry, it's only for Scotland and Northern Ireland. But again, UK Gov and the Welsh Gov, you can get your own down there as well. So yeah, how it's going to be dealt with now without endangering the human health, all the principles, how you're going to do it and how it needs to be revised and how much waste. So that's for a country, but then you do the exact same thing at your level. So how much waste is being produced in your site? What is the waste produced in your site? Where are you moving it to? So as it getting shipped from your national territory? How's it being picked up? What's your carrier license? What's your licensing? Are you allowed to store that? So that's there. Here's your waste management plans. This is one for England, and this is the one for Northern Ireland and Scotland. I've got nobody from Wales in here, but Chester's pretty close to Wales, isn't it? You might want to check the Welsh website as well, but that gives the country ones, and you can take that as a basis for developing waste management plans for the projects that you're working on. So what do we do? Plan and prepare. So can soil be used to landscape? So you're digging it out from one place. Can it be reused on that site? Therefore, you're not intending to discard it, so it's not waste. So think about if you've got cut and fill, if you're having to cut an embankment and then, or you know what I mean, cut and fill something, can you use the cut on site to make the fill? Therefore, you're not intending to discard it, therefore it's not a waste. Purchase materials to spec, so speak with your supplier and make sure that the project manager on site and the person responsible for the budgets and deliveries knows exactly how much is needed and when it's needed. You need to identify who's responsible for all of this. So someone has to take overall ownership. So generally before construction, it's the client and then it's the contractor during the construction phase. Remember the duty of care. That person or the waste producers are responsible for that all the way through to the end. So having one person in charge means that there's going to be, they know what's going on in the site. Now, everybody needs to be trained on why they're doing what they're doing and why they have to do it. But there will be one person on that form that's named as the person's responsible. They need to identify the waste. Now, this is what types of waste it is, and we'll look at how you can classify the waste, how much is being produced. And then, as I've said from the very beginning, think about every part of the project and every stage of that project. So it's not just little areas or pockets of work that's going on, the canteen, the office, the actual construction that's going on. It's about the different stages of the project, because a waste produced at the beginning isn't necessarily going to be the same produced towards the end of a project when you're building the wind turbines. So you need to clear the land before you can build. So there'll be different wastes produced at various different points. How are you going to dispose of it? Who has a license? Where's it going to go? Are they authorized to collect it? Organize it on site. So where's your recycling going to go? Can you use pre-used materials? Again, there's going to be other specific locations and places and storage requirements for hazardous waste compared to normal waste or non-hazardous waste. Everybody's got to be kept up to date. The waste management plan needs to be kept up to date as well. So that's your training, and that could, the training simply could be, you could put posters up around the canteen and make sure that people are aware of what's going on. Keep it up to date, because if the regulator comes in and looks at your audit and starts to audit you, sorry, and looks at your waste management plan and you're 2 or 3 weeks out of date and something's gone off site that's not supposed to have gone site, then that's a problem. So make sure you've got an in and out, that you know what's going on. Make sure that you know if the soil that's getting used, that's been cut out and is going to be used and it's transported somewhere else in the site, but it's going to be brought back in for fill. Make sure you know where that's going. Maybe look at zones within a site, say, well, you've moved soil from here to that, that's going to come back in. Like a big jigsaw, how's it all going to fit together? And yeah, keep it up to date. Have you met your targets? Now in England, if there's construction work over £300,000, which is quite a small amount, to be honest, then there's additional information that's required. And again, you'll get that from that waste management plan that I linked to. And this is what one looks, this is a very simple one. This is one from the NetRegs website. It's got everything that I've just talked about, name, when it was filled out, what part of the project is it on, all that, that's all there. Again, it's on the NetRegs website, there for you to have a wee look at. The important thing is for audit purposes, is you keep it up to date. You keep it current, and that person in charge knows where everything is. So how do we classify waste? You've got the European Waste Catalogue, and I don't think I put it into chat yet, but I'll give you this hyperlink in a second. It links to the SEPA website, but it's a European waste classification, so the numbers in that are going to be the same across the whole of the UK and Europe. So to ensure that the waste that we produce up here is classified as the same as the waste produced in Spain or France or Ireland, we've got a 6-digit code. The first 2 numbers are the chapter of the book. The second 2 is the subchapter, and then the last 2 is the waste type. There are 20 chapters in this book, and we'll look at them in the next slide. There are 20 chapters to this book. And it goes, if there's an asterisk present, then that is the hazardous or special waste. And if it doesn't have, then it's the non-hazardous waste. So this is example here. You're in the construction and demolition industry. You've knocked down a building, you've found a piece of metal, and you've been able to classify that as lead. So chapter 17 is all about construction and demolition waste. Section 4 is on metals. And then within that section, there'll be a list of the different types of metal. So lead is number 3. If I was, for instance, looking at some, and I'm looking at periodic table just now, some bizarre metal like tantalum, named after the Greek king Tantalus and the bad things that he did there. Tantalum, that might not have a number within that subchapter, that section. So you would label that as 17 because it's from the construction waste, 4 because it's from a metal, and you would classify it as 99 because it's not within that list. You still have that 6 number, and you will record somewhere what you're writing down. So that was 170499, and you would write whatever it is, as long as you've got a record of that. Now, if you've got an asterisk, then it's hazardous. So here is an example of dredging spoil containing hazardous substances. It's 17 because it's from this. It's dredging spoil, so that's 0.5, and it's got hazardous. So whatever it is, it's 0.5 with that asterisk. If it's non-hazardous, then that is just 170506. Okay, so if you see an asterisk, it's hazardous waste or special waste if you're north of the border here. Here are the different chapters. One is, one is mining, the agriculture, wood processing, leathers, petroleum, inorganics, organics, manufacturing, photography, thermal processes, chemistry, metals and plastics, oils, organics, packaging, wastes not otherwise specified unless that's the catch-all chapter, construction, human and healthcare wastes, waste management facilities, that's your waste treatment works, and then municipal wastes like household wastes. Now, let's just think, if you get a pallet of cement delivered, like little boxes of tubs, containers of cement, you've got a pallet, how would you classify that? What chapter do we think? What would that first chapter that you would look at? It's a pallet, so it's wood. Who wants to hazard a guess? Just basically look at this. Nobody want to hazard a guess? I'll do the countdown clock in my head. There you go. I would classify it as in there because it's the production of panels and furniture, pulp, paper, and cardboard wood processing. So perhaps could go in there as to deal with. It's not that. It's not that. It's definitely not them. So the first thing I would look at was I would go and look at chapter 3 to see if it's listed within chapter 3. Now, they do give you a very helpful guide. It's to be fair, I think it's a flowchart. You need to look at the waste and then just look at the index to see what chapter you think is going to fall in. But there is a code there to help you get through the European Waste Catalogue. It's pretty self-explanatory. You just need to have a look. We've only got 6 slides left, so we may actually be done to 12 o'clock. Storage of waste. You are responsible for storing it safely and legally because I'm just saying you're the waste producer. So the site that you're on as the waste producer, you're responsible for storing it safely and legally. You're doing it in a way that's not harming the environment, and you're doing it in a way that complies with your duty of care. So that's, remember, other things to your duty of care. You've got to make sure that it's stored, that it's transported off your site by somebody that's allowed to do it and goes to an authorized site for disposal. It must be removed from the site regularly. If you're going to store it for a long period, or if you're going to take somebody else's waste on your site, then you need a waste management license. And that license has got to be for the specific type of waste that you are generating on your site. So to make sure that it doesn't harm the environment, you've got to protect it from the wind and the rain. So make sure it doesn't blow away, make sure it doesn't leak into the water system. So maybe put it in a bund to make it with an impermeable surface so that it doesn't get into the water environment. Make sure that it's secure, so locks, etc. The gates and the perimeter fences are checked. Now I've got down there the Regulatory Reform Act. So remember, there was 4 things. If you act, fail to act, allow somebody to act, or don't act in a way that stops somebody acting. If your site's not secure, you're allowing somebody to harm the environment. So you have to be careful how that plays through. So think about the Regulatory Reform Scotland Act. And there are exemptions. You have to go through the regulator for these, but the exemptions are if you're going to do composting. Composting, you're going to recycle and reuse some of your materials. You are going to use it as a construction material, or you're using waste as a fuel. You need to go through the regulator to get exemptions to that, okay? And what I would say is always speak to your local regulator, whether it's your local authority, the planning office, or SEPA, or the Environment Agency. Always speak to them because they're the regulator. They know exactly what they want, and there'll be paperwork and there'll be bureaucracy. And if you don't fill in a paperwork correctly, then it's not going to be signed off, and all this takes a while. So make sure you're liaising not only with the local authority, the regulator, but the clients as well, to make sure that they know exactly what's going on. You must not, it is forbidden, it's verboten to bury waste materials, to burn waste materials unless you've got your license, to store it or transport it near fire sources, or to mix the hazardous special waste with any other material. So you need to have an area on your site that's for non-hazardous waste and a site that is for hazardous or special waste. They need to be kept separate. And then they'll have their own impermeable bonds, they'll have their own gates, they'll have their own locking system as well. So you need to keep them separate. Classify the waste. Remember, it's the asterisk that denotes it as hazardous waste, and you will need somebody with experience and competency to be able to determine that. So you need to, there'll be labs that you can work with. If you're storing on site for up to 12 months, and this is for the hazardous waste, then you don't need a waste management license. If you do, over 12 months, you're going to need that waste management license or a PPC. And this is all you're allowed to, and I don't know why I write, I've taken it from the regulations, but I don't know why they just don't write 23 meters cubed. So 23,000 litres of liquid waste in a secure container, or either this 80 meters cubed of any other waste in a secure container, or 50 meters of cubed in a secure place. Okay, so making sure that it's stored safely, and there is guidance available to you. So store it and securely to prevent pollution. Package it and label it correctly. So the 6-digit code with the asterisks. Keep your hazardous separate from everywhere else. Keep it away from your non-hazardous waste. Make sure that your liquid hazardous special waste is in a container to make sure that it doesn't leak out. Make sure you check it. So these are some of the things as with the non-hazardous waste, but remember, going back to pollution, you don't want to get pollutant linkages because your hazardous waste has created some sort of pollution. Make sure there's instructions put up for storing and disposing of that. And then finally, keep an inventory. So that's going back to making sure that your waste management plan is up to date, particularly if there's an incident or an accident and you need to get the emergency services involved. Because they're going to have to know what's on site. Because if they don't know what's on site and what chemicals are present and their dangers and toxicity, they might not go in because that would be deemed a risk to themselves. So you have to think about that. And if SEPA come on because you've had a pollution leakage somewhere and they come on and you've not kept an inventory, then think about the processes that the environmental regulators will go through to fine you. You've got to keep your non-hazardous. So this is transport, and make sure that you're sending off to someone that's allowed to do it. So there are different regulations for different administrations. In Scotland, you are a professional collector or a transport of waste. The definition is different down south. You have a non-hazardous, you have a waste transfer note that you keep for 2 years, and you remember your duty of care. For hazardous waste, it's a consignment note that you keep for 3 years, and it's got to be in sealed and labelled containers. And with both of them, you've got to make sure that it's going to landfill sites that are authorised to accept it. Remember, there's 3 different landfill sites. There's the inert, there's the non-hazardous, and then there's the hazardous waste landfill site. You've got to make sure that your hazardous waste is going to that site. The hazardous waste landfill has got more protection around about it. There'll be leak detection systems in it. There'll be gas collection systems in it. There'll be layers of capping. There'll be clays. There'll be barriers put around there to stop this stuff leaking. So you've got to make sure that that is going there. Before we go to the homework then, has anybody got any questions? Or will I go over the homework first, stop recording, and then you can ask questions? How does that work? I'll do that. So, in one A4 page, okay, you can do this in 3 paragraphs, okay? I don't need a paragraph for every single one of these. You can lump them together. So what waste do you think is produced on in your case study, and how you would classify that? So that's using the European Waste Catalogue. Okay, that can be paragraph 1. You can put a table in if you want. Don't care. Just think about waste. It doesn't have to be all the waste that's produced. Give me 4 or 5 different types of waste and how you're going to classify it. Question 2. How would you store it without polluting the environment? And if it did pollute the environment, how would you deal with it? That's kind of contamination aspects of it. And then the third paragraph, how would you minimize the waste produced on site? And how would you minimize the amount of waste transferred for disposal? So 3 questions are waste, what waste is produced and how you would classify it. Question 2 is how would you store it without polluting the environment? And what would you do if it did pollute the environment? And then the third question, third paragraph, how would you minimize waste produced on site? And how would you minimize the amount of waste transferred for disposal? They're kind of similar. So that's the homework. I don't think there's a deadline other than towards the end of the course that you put it on, and I'll go in and look at it. You don't get a grade, it's pass or fail for this. Okay, so you've got everything you should have to complete that assignment. I'm going to stop the recording now. So this, I don't know how you get the recording. It gets stored to the cloud, so presumably somebody from the CPT team downloads it and makes it available for you. So I'm going to stop that now.